Hi, I'm Ed Stetzer. I'm the Dean of the Talbot School of Theology at Biola University. But in this case, I'm just going to talk a little bit about Lausanne. I happen to be the regional director for Lausanne, North America, United States and Canada, and we're getting close to the Lausanne Congress, L4 as it's called, in Seoul. And so people have asked me some questions that I thought maybe I'd address in a series of short videos that might be helpful for you to understand a little bit what's going on in the Lausanne Movement. I'm not a spokesperson for the Lausanne Movement. I serve in a volunteer role as the North American regional leader, regional director, but let me just share a few things that people have been asking me. So one of the first questions is, what is Lausanne and how does it kind of place itself in the great grand tradition of 2,000 years of Christian history? So Lausanne is an evangelical movement, and I think that word evangelical is much more readily embraced from our global sisters and brothers. It's a little bit more controversial in the U.S. right now, but founded by Billy Graham and John Stott, and there's a whole history that's there, but the desire, and I don't think as many people might not know this, but the desire early on was to mobilize evangelical Christians for the task of global mission. So the full name is the Lausanne Committee for World Evangelization. In some ways, that was a response. I think probably a lot of people aren't as up on these things. It was a response to what's called the conciliar missions movement. So the world Christians gathered, I'm going to use the word world this way intentionally, but world Christians from their perspective gathered in 1910 in Edinburgh, Scotland under John Mott. And they wanted to see the evangelization of the world in this generation. And that launched what's called the Conciliar Missions Movement, eventually became the IMC, the International Missionary Council, and eventually was absorbed into the World Council of Churches. Now, the reason I mention this is that in 1910, the world Christians largely were people from the Western world. There are very few people not from the West that were there. So think, US, UK, continent of Europe, and more. And there were a lot of mistakes made there. One of the mistakes made there was not to lay out a theological foundation for what they believed. And the end result was, within a few decades, there were meetings in 1928, there were meetings in 1938, there were meetings, anyway, I won't go through all the history of that. I teach on this topic, so I get a little passionate about it. But Billy Graham and John Stott wanted to, among other things, to say, that's not where that movement ended up going. For example, they eventually they de-emphasized the place of personal conversion. They actually reimagined evangelism. Evangelism was no longer the verbal proclamation of the gospel, inviting women and men to respond by grace and through faith, but they began to use terms like larger evangelism. And it became more and more about societal transformation, social justice, which are things that are important we're going to talk about. But Graham and Stott wanted to create a movement and invite others who wanted to evangelize the world, to show and share the love of Jesus. Now, Stott and Graham were not actually on the same page on everything about, for example, the place of societal transformation, and we'll talk more about that in a subsequent video, but they were clear in that this is what they were forming. So one of the things I think that as Lausanne meets again in this Congress, we want to be sure that we don't repeat the Edinburgh error, which is not having a theological foundation, not having a clear definition of what we mean by evangelism and the proclamation of the gospel, not having a clearly articulated view of where societal transformation fits into that and more. But knowing a little bit of the history that the Lausanne movement emerged out of a milieu that in some ways was responding to a movement near the end of its life, which had in some ways lost, I'd say in a lot of ways, lost its original purpose. So by the time the International Missionary Council is merged into the IMC, is merged into the World Council of Churches, they're not talking about planting churches. They're not talking about, by and large, there's certainly some, talking about individual conversion, responding by grace and through faith, and more. So I think it's worth noting that in the past, when Christians have gathered together. In 1910, they believed a lot like what most of us will believe as we gather together in the L4 Congress. It's important to remember that we have decisions to make. We have a view of the gospel to uphold. We have a passion for evangelism to keep front and center. And I think ultimately, that's something we're going to need to remind ourselves of in Seoul at L4. So again, the beginning of the Lausanne movement points to, I think, again, the continuing passion of it is let's be focused. There's all kinds of wonderful ministries and missions doing all kinds of wonderful things, but we want to see the whole church sharing the whole gospel to the whole world. And that's going to include finding ways to prioritize things like evangelism, church planting, and traditional missions. It also includes, and we'll talk about why Graham and Stott differed on this, it also includes, doing what the Great Commission says, make disciples, teach them to observe, and that ultimately leads to some impact, an important impact on society as well. But again, be praying for us as we're headed to L4 in just a matter of weeks, that we will, that those who come behind us find us faithful, that ultimately we won't look back like people look back to Edinburgh and says, ironically, the Edinburgh meeting in 1910 is considered the end of the great century of missions. The great century of missions starts in the late 1700s and ends in 1910 by most historical accounting. So we want L4 to be the beginning of a great mobilization and a great harvest to ultimately see women and men respond to the good news of the gospel around the world. So pray for us at L4 that we make much of Jesus and stay focused on his mission.